The Great Celtic Saga. Volume 1. The History of the Celtic Tribes of Europe. Volume 2. The History of Albion and her tribes. Volume 3. The History of Scotland and her clans. By Raven Bloodstone. The Great Celtic Saga. Volume 1. The History of the Celtic Tribes of Europe. By Raven Bloodstone. The History of the Celtic Tribes of Europe. By Raven Bloodstone. A Chronicle of the Ancient Peoples of the West. Their history, culture, and faith from the dawn of time to the modern age. Author's foreword. There are songs older than the wind, and stories written not in books, but in the living stones of the earth. This work is dedicated to the peoples who lived in harmony with the rhythm of the world, to those who carved spirals into rock, who sang to the stars, who tended the sacred fire when the world was young. The history that follows is not only that of tribes and wars, but a vision, the story of how humankind once knew the earth as holy, and how that wisdom, though buried by empire and time, still flows beneath our feet like an unseen river. May these pages be a bridge between past and future, between the memory of the Celts and the awakening of all who seek to live again in harmony with the living world. Raven Bloodstone. Dedication. To the memory of the ancestors, to those who dreamed before us, and to those who will dream after. To the druids who kept the fire, to the poets who remembered, to the mothers who wove the songs of the tribe. To the spirits of the land, the mountains and the seas, and to the eternal mother whose breath moves through all that lives. And to the seekers of today, children of the same flame, who still walk the forest paths. Listen to the wind, and remember that the world is alive. For the old gods are not gone. They dwell within every leaf and every heart that still believes. The History of the Celtic Tribes of Europe. By Raven Bloodstone. Forward. The Echoes of the Sacred West. There are whispers still upon the wind, whispers that rise from the mists that shroud the ancient hills of Europe. They tell of a people who once danced between worlds, who spoke the language of rivers and trees, who saw in the flight of ravens and the ripple of water the messages of gods. They were the Celts, wanderers, dreamers, and poets of the sacred earth. The story of the Celtic peoples is older than memory, older even than written word. It is a tale carved in stone, sung in bronze, and written in the shifting patterns of stars. Across the wide heart of Europe, from the misted highlands of Air to the oak valleys of Gaul, from Iberia's western cliffs to the alpine lakes of Helvetia, their spirits spread like a green fire, fierce and enduring. Their world was one where the natural and the divine were never apart. Forests were temples, rivers, living goddesses, and every mountain a seat of power. The druids, keepers of wisdom, walked between the visible and invisible worlds, binding tribe and cosmos in sacred harmony. Warriors swore oaths beneath moonlight, poets wove the words of creation, and blacksmiths forged not only weapons but destinies. Though Rome sought to crush their power, and Christendom to baptize their faith, the Celtic flame never died. It smoldered in secret groves, it flickered in the songs of the bards, and it rose anew in every generation that heard the old names, Brigid, Cernunnos, Luff, Morrigan, and felt something stir within the blood. This book is a journey through that memory, through history and myth, through battle and ritual, through the souls of tribes who once ruled the forests of Europe. The IT seeks not only to record the deeds of the Celts, but to rekindle the understanding that once all life was kin, and every man and woman was a child of the earth. May you, as you read, hear the whisper of the sacred West calling again. Part 1. The Dawn of the Celts. Chapter 1. The Indo-European Origins. Before the Celts had a name, before even Europe was Europe, there existed a great river of peoples flowing from the Dawnlands of the East. From the misty steppes north of the Black Sea came tribes who carried with them the seeds of language, law, and song, the Proto-Indo-Europeans. They were riders of horses, makers of bronze, and dreamers of sky gods. Among their many children, the Greeks, the Latins, the Aryans, there would arise one branch that turned westward into the green heart of the continent. These would one day be called Keltoi. Archaeology gives them form through shards of pottery, the marks of chieftains' barrows, and the glitter of bronze blades. Linguistics traces their speech, the ancient tongue that would become Irish, Welsh, Breton, and Gaelic, a melodic echo that still rings through modern Europe. By 1200 BCE, these Proto-Celtic tribes were spreading into the Danube Basin, the heartland of what would become the Hallstatt culture. They built fortified settlements, traded in amber, salt, and tin, and raised great chiefs who ruled not by iron alone, but by the sanction of the gods. Their world was alive with myth. The thunder of Taranis, the bright wheel of Belinos, the earth's motherly pulse of Danu. Even then, the roots of Celtic religion had begun to grow deep into the soil of Europe. The Celts were not a single nation but a symphony of tribes, united by tongue and spirit, yet scattered like seeds by the winds of time. Their migrations carried them across the forests of Germany, into Gaul, the Iberian Peninsula, and eventually across the sea to Britain and Ayr. Wherever they went, they left not ruins, butrunes, symbols of a living connection to the land. Part 1. The Dawn of the Celts. Chapter 2. The Hallstatt Civilization, the Birth of Celtic Identity. In the long dawn before recorded history, where myth and archaeology intertwine, a new civilization began to rise among the mountains and lakes of Central Europe. Around 800 BCE, in the valleys of the Salzkammergut, the salt-rich lands of modern Austria, there emerged a people whose artistry, trade, and spiritual vision would define the first great age of Celtic culture. This was the Hallstatt civilization, named for the small Austrian village where their graves and treasures were first unearthed. To the modern scholar, Hallstatt marks the beginning of the Celtic story. To the mystic, it is the moment when the old European soul, born of earth, sky, and forest, awoke and found its voice. The Salt Lords of the Mountains. Salt, the white gold of the ancients, was the lifeblood of Hallstatt. In those early centuries, salt was not merely a mineral. It was preservation itself, the power to defy decay and feed the living through winter's hunger. The mines of Hallstatt were sacred wounds in the mountain, where men descended into the dark with antler picks and firelight, whispering prayers to the underworld spirits who guarded the veins of the earth. From this white wealth came trade, and from trade came power. The chiefs of Hallstatt rose to prominence not only as warriors but as merchants, dealing in amber from the Baltic, bronze from the Carpathians, gold from Iberia, and fine pottery from Etruria and Greece. They became the aristocracy of Europe's interior, chieftains whose burial mounds rivaled the tombs of kings. In their graves, archaeologists have found the emblems of authority, swords of exquisite craftsmanship, chariots, drinking horns, torques of gold and bronze, and sometimes the remains of horses, the sacred companions of Celtic nobility. The presence of such grave goods reveals not mere wealth, but belief, a faith in the continuation of the soul and the journey into the other world. The warrior chieftains and the Druidic dawn. The Hallstatt age was ruled by the warrior elite, but beneath their swords and splendor stirred the beginnings of a deeper order, that of Thedrui, the priestly and learned caste that would later shape the Celtic world. Though no written records remain, we can glimpse their emergence through ritual sites and sacred symbols. On the altars and ornaments of Hallstatt, the solar wheel appears, the emblem of the sun god Daranis and the eternal cycle of life and death. The spiral, the most ancient of symbols, is carved upon brooches and sword hilts, marking the belief that time was not linear, but ever-evolving. Fire and water, sky and earth, were understood not as opposites, but as partners in the cosmic dance. In the mists of dawn, the Druids looked to the horizon and read in the movements of sun and star the laws of balance. Theirs was a world where nothing was inert. Every tree held a spirit, every river had a name. These beliefs, born in the Hallstatt valleys, would one day become the foundation of Celtic religion itself. Art, trade, and the sacred landscape. The art of Hallstatt was both fierce and refined, geometry and nature entwined. Bronze broochware shaped like birds, animals, and curling vines, mirroring the living world around them. Even their weapons were decorated with care, for to the Celts, the sword was not a tool of death alone, but a sacred symbol of honor and spirit. Trade routes radiated like veins through the heart of Europe, connecting the Celts to the Mediterranean and beyond. They learned from the Greeks and Etruscans, yet what they borrowed they transformed, turning foreign influences into a distinctly Celtic expression. In this synthesis, one can sense the essence of the Celtic genius, to blend, not imitate, to create anew from the bones of the old. The land itself became their greatest teacher. Mountains were the dwellings of gods, rivers, the arteries of life. Every region, every tribe, every grove was part of a sacred geography that bound people to place. To be Celtic was to belong to the land as deeply as the oak to the soil. The decline of Hallstatt and the birth of a new age. By 500 BCE, the Hallstatt world began to wane. The great salt mines grew silent, their wealth exhausted, and new powers were stirring to the north and west. But the Celtic spirit did not die, it transformed. Out of the ashes of Hallstatt rose a brighter, more dynamic age. The Latin culture, centered upon the shores of Lake Neuchâtel in what is now Switzerland. Where Hallstatt was solemn and regal, Latin would be fluid and expressive, an age of warriors, poets, and artists whose works would spread across all Europe. Hallstatt gave the Celts their roots, Latin would give them their wings. Part 1. The Dawn of the Celts. Chapter 3. The Latin Culture, the Flowering of Celtic Civilization. When the fires of Hallstatt had cooled, a new light began to rise across the lands between the Rhine and the Alps. By 500 BCE, from the glittering waters of Lake Neuchâtel in what is now Switzerland, there blossomed a culture whose beauty, artistry, and spiritual vision would define the Celts at the height of their power. This was the Latin civilization, the golden age of Celtic Europe. The birth of a new aesthetic and spirit. Named after the site where thousands of artifacts were discovered along the lake's shore, Latina was more than a culture. It was a renaissance of the soul. The Celts of this era took the strength and structure of their Hallstatt ancestors and infused it with imagination, fluidity, and sacred artistry. Bronze and iron curled into living shapes, serpents, spirals, and flowing vines, all revealing a people who saw spirit and motion in all things. Their art rejected the rigid symmetry of Greece and Rome. It was organic, like wind through leaves or water around stone, an art born of the natural world. Swords were inlaid with coral and enamel, scabbards rippled like rivers, and shields bore faces of gods whose eyes watched from the bronze. These forms were not mere decoration, they were prayer. Every line carried meaning, a symbolic language speaking of rebirth, of the eternal dance between the visible and the unseen. In this style, we witness the Celtic worldview made manifest. Nothing static, nothing dead, only transformation, the divine spiral that connects all life. The expansion of the Celtic tribes. The Latin age was also an age of movement. The Celts were not bound to one place. They were explorers, traders, settlers, and warriors. From their central homelands, they spread across the continent like wildfire. To the west, they poured into Gaul and across the sea into the British Isles. To the south, they descended into northern Italy, where they sacked Rome itself in 390 BCE under the chieftain Brennus, leaving a wound in Roman memory that would never heal. To the east, Celtic bands crossed the Danube and reached as far as the Balkans and Anatolia, founding the legendary kingdom of Galatian Asia Minor. Everywhere they went, they brought their language, their crafts, and their gods. Villages grew into fortified hill forts, oppida, centers of trade, worship, and governance. The Celts were both fierce warriors and gifted negotiators, often serving as mercenaries in the armies of other nations, yet always retaining their own tribal identity and mystic pride. The Sacred Society, Druids, Bards, and Chieftains. By the Latine period, Celtic society had reached a complexity unseen before. At its heart stood the Druids, priests, judges, healers, and philosophers who embodied the bridge between the mortal and divine realms. They studied the stars, memorized vast laws and genealogies, and guided their tribes with spiritual authority that even kings obeyed. Their teachings were never written, for they believed sacred knowledge should live in the mind, not in ink. The bards were the memory of the people, keepers of song, history, and praise. Through verse they immortalized heroes, and through satire they could destroy reputations. In a world without written record, the bard's word was power. The chieftains ruled by both sword and sanctity. Their authority was legitimated through ritual, their lineage blessed by the gods. At the tribal feasts of Samhain and Beltane, the bonds between ruler and ruled were renewed, not through tyranny, but through sacred trust and shared myth. Warriors and the sacred path of battle. To the Celts, war was not mere conquest. It was a test of honor and courage, an offering to the gods. Warriors rode to battle not in silence, but in song, their war horns echoing across valleys like the calls of ancient beasts. They fought with fury, often stripping bare save for a torque around the neck, a sign of bravery and divine protection. To die with courage was to be reborn in glory, for the Celts believed in the cycle of life, death, and return. Even the Romans, who both feared and admired them, described their ferocity and strange splendor. Warriors whose mustaches shone with lime, whose cloaks were dyed in brilliant colors, and whose laughter rose in the midst of battle. The Toa Celt. The battlefield was a sacred theater where fate and faith met. The sacred geography and the world of the gods. Everywhere the Celts went, they remade the land into a living temple. Rivers were holy, the goddess Sequana at the source of the Seine, Sulis at the waters of Bath. Mountains were the throne-soft deities, and groves were the sanctuaries of the Druids. No stone was dead, no spring unblessed. The Latine Celts lived in communion with the otherworld, not a place of punishment or paradise, but a realm that interwove with the living world. The ancestors walked there, the gods spoke there, and dreams were the bridges between. Through the mists of their imagination, we glimpse a people for whom life itself was sacred art, and whose civilization, though long fallen, still speaks through the symbols that endure on stone, metal, and myth. The legacy of Latine. By the 2nd century BCE, the Latine world reached its zenith. Yet from the south came the slow, relentless tide of Rome. The legions brought discipline, law, and empire, but they also brought fire. The free tribes of Gaul and Britain, once lords of the forest, would soon face their greatest trial. But the flame of Latine did not die with conquest. Its symbols lived on in Christian manuscripts like the Book of Kells. Its motifs survived in art and jewelry, and its faith transmuted into legend. Even as the Roman eagle rose, the spiral of the Celts continued to turn, carrying the sacred geometry of the West through every age that followed. Part 1. The Dawn of the Celts. Chapter 4. Celtic Expansion, the Tribes of Europe and the Isles. The story of the Celts is a story of motion, of rivers, roads, and restless hearts seeking new lands beneath the same eternal sky. By the 5th century before the Common Era, The Celtic peoples had grown beyond their alpine cradle. They were no longer a single culture bound to the lakes and mountains of Latine, but a constellation of tribes that stretched across the living map of Europe. From the Atlantic shores to the Danube, from the highlands of Iberia to the misted coasts of Britain, the Celts had become the voice of the West, an entire civilization without an empire, united not by crown or capital, but by kinship, language, and spirit. The migration of the tribes. Archaeology and myth together tell the tale. The Celts, drawn by the promise of new lands and trade, began to migrate along the great river routes, the Rhine, the Rhone, and the Danube. Each tribe carried its own gods, its own totems, its own sacred stories. Some sought fertile valleys, others the metals of the mountains or the salt of the plains. But always they carried the same fire, the Celtic way, that reverence for the land and for the eternal cycles of life and death. These migrations were not invasions in the modern sense. The Celts were settlers, traders, and sometimes conquerors, but they blended as much as they conquered. Wherever they went, they wove their spirit into the land. A Roman historian once wrote, "The Celts are everywhere and nowhere, for they become the land they dwell upon." By the 4th century BCE, the Celts had spread so widely that their tribes could be found in nearly every corner of Western Europe. Gaul, the heart of the Celtic world. Of all Celtic lands, none shone more brightly than Gaul, the vast region that would one day become France, Belgium, and parts of Switzerland. It was here that Celtic civilization reached its greatest extent, a patchwork of dozens of tribes, each with its own kings, druids, and customs, yet bound by a shared language and reverence for the gods. Tribes such as the Dui, Arverni, Sequani, and Carnutes thrived in the river valleys and forests of Gaul. Their hill forts, Caledopida, became centers of art, trade, and ceremony. To the south, they traded with the Greeks of Massalia, modern Marseille, exchanging amber antin for wine and pottery. To the north, they traded with the Britons across the Channel, carrying ideas, myths, and bloodlines. Gaul became the spiritual and political heart of Celtic Europe, the place where Druids gathered, where tribal alliances were formed, and where later the great hero Vercingetorix's wild rise challenged the might of Rome itself. The Celts in Iberia, the Western Flame. Westward, the Celts moved into the Iberian Peninsula, mingling with the native Iberian peoples to form the Celtiberians, fierce warriors and master smiths who inhabited the mountains of modern Spain. Their cities, like Numancia, became symbols of defiance and courage, resisting Roman conquest with a ferocity that entered legend. The Iberian Celts brought with them their gods of fire and war, their circular hill forts, and their intricate art. They were known for their skill in horsemanship and for their use of long iron swords, weapons of superb craftsmanship, later adopted even by the Romans themselves. In the far west, near the lands of the Lusitanians, modern Portugal, the Celts reached the edge of the known world, where the sun sank into the Atlantic and the ocean was believed to be the boundary of life and death. Here, perhaps, the Celtic soul first looked westward to the Isles, where destiny awaited. The Celts of northern Italy, the Cisalpine tribes. In the fertile plains of the Pie Valley, Celtic tribes known as the Insubres, Boy, and Senones established new kingdoms. They were drawn by the wealth of the Etruscans and the rising power of Rome, and in 390 BCE, they left a mark upon history that would echo through millennia. Led by the chieftain Brennus, the Senons descended upon Rome, defeating its armies at the river Allia. The Eternal City was sacked, its citizens fled, and when the Romans begged for peace, Brennus cast his sword upon the scales and declared, "Vi victis, woe to the vanquished." This was not merely an act of conquest. It was a statement of divine favor. a sign that the old gods of the north had humbled the iron legions of the south. Though Rome would rise again, this wound would never heal, and in time, Rome's vengeance would be turned upon the very people who had once conquered her. The Eastern expansion, the Galatians of Anatolia. By the 3rd century BCE, some Celtic tribes journeyed eastward, crossing the Balkans and entering the lands of Thrace and Greece. They were mercenaries and adventurers, drawn by promise of plunder and the whispers of destiny. In 279 BCE, under another Brennus, the Celts stormed into Greece and even reached the sacred site of Delphi, the navel of the world. There, amid thunder and storm, the gods themselves were said to have struck down the invaders, yet not all perished. A great host journeyed onward into Asia Minor, where they were invited by local kings to settle. These became the Galatians, who founded a Celtic homeland in the heart of Anatolia. Even centuries later, when St. Paul addressed his epistle to the Galatians, he wrote to the descendants of Celtic warriors, their language, customs, and pride still alive in a foreign land. The Celts had become truly pan-European, a vast, interwoven people without borders, bound bymyth, art, and the unseen thread of spirit. Across the Western Sea, the Isles of Britain and Ayr. While some tribes journeyed east into Asia, others turned west, across the narrow waters of the Channel, where the lands of Falbinandir lay waiting. Here the Celts would meet the ancient peoples of stone and mist, merging their blood and belief into something new. The insular Celtic nations, the Britons, Gaels, and Picts. In Britain, tribes such as the Trinovants, Iceni, and Brigantes ruled the plains and forests. In Ayr, myth remembers the Fir Bolg, Tuatha De Danann, and Milesians, divine and mortal races whose legends echo the memory of early Celtic migrations. Across these islands, the Celtic flame took root more deeply than anywhere else. Their oral tradition, their myths, and their language would endure long after Rome had come and gone. The spirit of expansion. The Celtic expansion was not the march of empire. It was the unfolding of a worldview. Wherever the Celts went, they brought with them a faith in life's sacred rhythm and a reverence for the living land. They built no vast cities, carved no marble monuments, but their mark endures in the very shape of Europe, in place names, in languages, and in the invisible geometry of belief. Theirs was a civilization not of walls, but of roots. And though the centuries would bring conquest and loss, the Celtic tribes had already achieved what few ever have. They made the world itself their homeland. End of preview of Volume 1. The Great Celtic Saga. The History of Albion and Her Tribes. By Raven Bloodstone. Chapter 1. The Dawn of Albion, the Land Before History. Before the word was written, and before the plow scarred the earth, the land itself spoke in stone and song. Long before England bore her modern name, before Rome's legions cut their roads across her back, the island was called Albion, the White Land, after her shining cliffs that rise like the bones of the earth from the misty sea. To the ancient seafarers who approached from the south, those cliffs gleamed ghostly pale, the first vision of land beyond the western horizon. To her people, she was more than a land. She was a living goddess, a body of sacred hills, rivers, and stones. The first peoples and the sacred landscape. Archaeology tells us that by 10,000 years ago, the first settlers had returned after the Ice Age withdrew. They came from the west and south, following herds, bringing with them a reverence for the land that shaped all who lived upon it. The forests of oak, birch, and yew covered the island from shore to shore, and within them moved the ancestors of the later Britons, the first Albians. These were themigolith builders, the architects of mystery. They raised stone circles in perfect alignment with the stars, Stonehenge, Avebury, Cownish, and hundreds of lesser sanctuaries now lost beneath field and hedge. Each was a temple of time, a calendar in stone, and a communion between earth and sky. To these people, there was no division between the spiritual and the material. The land itself was sacred scripture. The rising of the solstice sun, the flow of rivers, the pattern of constellations, these were their holy texts. The religion of the Earth Mother. Before the thunder of male gods and the wars of kings, there was only a mother. She was the spirit of fertility, of the moon and the harvest, of womb and tomb alike. Across the island, the people carved her image in stone, round-bellied figurines and chalk hill carvings that spoke overbirth and endless return. The mound graves, such as West Kennet and Newgrange across the sea, were built in her likeness. The earth's belly entered through a stone passage as though re-entering the womb to be reborn with the sun. The Albians believed that all life came from the mother's body. The rivers were her veins, the hills her breasts, the forests her hair. When they sowed grain, they offered the first sheaf to her. When they buried their dead, they did so with flowers and shells, returning each soul to her embrace. In his ancient matriarchal cosmology, humanity was not separate from nature, but a participant in her eternal cycles. The coming of the tribes. In the 3rd and 2nd millennia BCE, new peoples arrived, the Beaker-folk and Proto-Celts, bringing bronze and new customs, yet they too merged with the old. There was no conquest, only blending, for all revered the same mother and the same stars. From this union arose the tribes later known as the Britons, each with their own gods and heroes, but sharing a single spirit, that of Albion herself. The land became divided among sacred tribal realms, the Brigantes of the north, the Iceni of the east, the Dumnonii of the west, and the Silures of the south. Each tribe guarded a portion of the sacred landscape, maintaining the rites and keeping the knowledge of the druids, those wise ones who served as priests, healers, astronomers, and poets. They did not worship idols of stone, but the living presence of the divine in water, in fire, and mist. The voice of stone and water. Every valley had its spirit, every spring its goddess. Rivers were personified as divine mothers: Sabrina, Severn, Avon, Dee, Tamar, Themesis, Thames, each with her own stories and offerings. The people of Albion lived in harmony with these spirits, bound by covenant rather than dominion. To break the balance was taboo, for the land's favor ensured the tribe's survival. At the center of their worldview stood the Kalish, the old woman of the hills, bringer of winter and shaper of mountains. Her legend stretched back into the midst of prehistory. A primal goddess formed Albion by dropping stones from her apron as she strode across the landscape. Later myths remember her as the Hagir, or as the Morgan, or even transfigured in Christian guise as Saint Bride, but always she remained the land's first guardian. The harmony before the empires. For thousands of years, Albion flourished in peace. Her people farmed, hunted, and raised their monuments. Her seers read the bones of the skies. Trade routes connected her to Gaul, Iberia, and even to the distant Mediterranean. Bronze flowed like blood between the tribes, carrying with Lydia's tales. The language spoken across her lands was the root of later phonic tongues, the mother Welsh, Cornish, and Breton. In this age before history, the island's people lived without kings or empires, guided instead by their councils of druids. Their law was the rhythm of the seasons, their government, the will of the tribe, their currency, honor, and kinship. To them, conquest was folly, for who could conquer the goddess herself? The veil descends, and yet time moves as the tide. New powers would rise upon the continent, and Albion's peace would not last. Rome's shadow loomed across the sea, and with it came the end of innocence. But before the eagle banners and the Christian cross, before sword and scripture wrote her name, Albion was whole, a sacred isle, inhabited by those who knew the pulse of the land and the secrets of the stars. The The song of the stones still whispers in the wind, and those who listen may yet hear it. Beneath the soil of England, Scotland, and Wales, beneath cities and cathedrals, the bones of mothers still dream. Chapter 2. The Britons and their world. They called themselves the children of the land, for to be of Albion was to be of her soil and her song. When the mists of prehistory began to thin and the first dawn of recorded time touched the island, the tribes of Albion were already ancient. Their roots reached back beyond memory, their language carrying echoes of forgotten gods. Though later chroniclers named them Britons, they were many peoples woven into one tapestry, kin of the same earth, divided by rivers and mountains yet united by custom, belief, and blood. The tribal realms of the island. By the Iron Age, Albion was a constellation of tribal kingdoms. In the north stretched the lands of the Brigantes, proud and numerous, their queens ruling from the Pennine Hills. To the west, among the mountains and rivers, dwelled the Wardava Silures, fierce defenders of their ancestral valleys. In the east and south lay the fertile plains of the Iceni, Trinovants, and Catavalani, where trade and craftsmanship flourished. In the far west, among the cliffs and mists of Dumnonia, what we now call Cornwall and Devon, the Dumnon attended their tin mines and worshipped the sea gods. Each tribe held its hill fort, not a castle of conquest, but a sacred stronghold, a symbol of the tribe's spirit. From Maiden cast Leto Cadbury, Traprain Lotto Dinas Emrys, these citadels crowned the land like jewels upon a green diadem. Within their walls lived chieftains, druids, warriors, craftsmen, and poets, the full expression of tribal life. Though each realm had its own king or queen, they were bound by shared law, trade, and a complex network of alliances. War came often, as it does among kin, but these were ritualized conflicts, contests of honor rather than extermination. For to spill too much of the land's blood was to anger the gods. Art and expression of the Britons. The Britons were artists of extraordinary imagination. Their art flowed with spirals, knotwork, and triskels, forms symbolizing the eternal cycles of life, death, and rebirth. Gold torques adorned the necks of nobles. Mirrors of polished bronze reflected not only the face, but the spirit. Their craftsmanship blended beauty and power. Chariots rimmed with bronze, cauldrons engraved with beasts of myth, swords inscribed with sigils of protection. Unlike the Roman love of symmetry, the Celtic mind sought motion, a living pattern that spiraled like the galaxies they saw mirrored in their rituals. Every design held meaning. Tetrascala symbolized the triad: earth, sea, and sky, body, mind, and spirit, birth, death, and renewal. For them, art was not decoration but invocation. Their music, now lost to time, was said to stir both courage and sorrow. Harps, pipes, and drums echoed in the feasting halls, and Thebirds, keepers of song and history, recited the deeds of ancestors. Through them, the tribe remembered who they were, for memory itself was sacred. The Druidic Order. At the center of British life stood the Druids, the priests and philosophers of Albion. They were the bridge between worlds, mediators between the people and the gods. Their training was long and arduous, said to last 20 years, for they had to master astronomy, law, medicine, poetry, and the cycles of the stars. They memorized vast verses of wisdom, never committing sacred lore to writing, believing that truth must live within the heart and voice, not upon dead parchment. The Druids gathered at the great sanctuaries, at Anglesey, Stonehenge, and Avebury, and at the forest groves of oak and mistletoe. There they held ceremonies at the turning of the seasons, Samhain, Imbolc, Beltane, and Lugnasad, the festivals of the sun's journey and the earth's renewal. Through their rites, the balance between human life and nature was maintained. They taught that to live justly was to live in harmony with all creation. In their philosophy, every soul was immortal. Death was a door, not an end. The spirit passed into the other world, the realm of an to be reborn when the cycle turned anew. This faith in reincarnation gave the Britons their fearlessness in battle, for what was death but a change of form? The sacred geography of Albion. The land itself was a holy text, each hill and river of verse that to the Britons. Geography was theology. Mount Snowdon, Glastonbury Tor, Silbury Hill, the Peak District, and the White Horse Hills were seen as manifestations of divine power. The rivers were goddesses: Sabrina, Avon, Tamar, Deva, and Isis, flowing from the heart of the Motherto, the encircling sea. Springs were portals to the other world, and wells were guarded by maidens whose spirits demanded offerings of silver or song. To journey across the land was a pilgrimage through sacred time. The boundaries between realms, Thalimsoft tribe and element, were honored as thresholds where the veil between worlds grew thin. There, druids sought visions and warriors took oaths, for to swear upon the liminal ground was to be heard by both gods and ancestors. The heroes and queens. Among the Britons, lineage and legend intertwined. There was Caratacus, who defied Rome and became a symbol of resistance. There was Boudica, queen of the Iceni, whose vengeance burned like wildfire when the Romans violated her daughters and her realm. Even in defeat, her name became immortal, a spirit of righteous wrath that would never die. And beyond history's veil stood the mythic kings. Brutus of Troy, said to have founded Britain and named her for himself. Locrinus and Camber, the legendary sons who divided Albion's lands. And later, Arthur Pendragon, whose legend would arise from these same hills, a memory of kingship older than Rome. Society and the balance of life. Contrary to Roman accounts, the Britons were not savages but deeply civilized in their own way. Their law, the Brehon Code, was built upon restitution, not revenge. Justice was measured by harmony restored, not punishment inflicted. Women held power as judges, healers, and warriors. Marriage could be entered and dissolved by mutual consent, property inherited through both lines. Echoes of the old matriarchal order still alive. The tribe was a living organism, each member bound by kinship. To dishonor one's kin was token the tribe's soul. To speak truth, to uphold hospitality, to defend the weak, these were sacred duties. Honor, not wealth, was the true currency of life. The veiled faith beneath the cross. Even as Rome's influence began to creep into Albion, the old religion endured. The Britons were masters of adaptation. They could cloak their gods in new names without losing their meaning. Thegades Brigantia became Saint Brigid. Belinus, god of the sun, became Saint Blazer Saint Bell. And Cernunnos, lord of the wild things, became whispered as Herne, haunting the forests off Windsor and Sherwood. The ancient faith went underground, carried in story and song, hidden in the very soul of the people. A world of balance and spirit. Before empire, before creed, Albion's people lived in harmony with the cosmos. Their world was one of reciprocity. Give and receive, sow and reap, live and return. They were neither primitive nor naive. They understood that all life was connected through the sacred thread of being. In every hearth fire and standing stone, in every grove and river bend, they found the divine. And though the world would soon change, with Roman legions, Christian missionaries, and the chroniclers who sought to erase their names, the Briton's spirit endured. It is the same spirit that sings still beneath England's green fields and Wales's dark hills, the same that whispers through Scotland's glens. Albion remembers. End of preview of Volume 2. The Great Celtic Saga. The History of the Scotland and Her Clans. By Raven Bloodstone. The History of Scotland and Her Clans by Raven Bloodstone. A chronicle of the land, the people, and the eternal spirit of Alba, from the painted Picts to the fires of Culloden, and beyond into the living soul of Scotland. Dedication. To the mountains and the mists. To the people who carried Scotland in their hearts across the seas, and to the ancestors who still walk in the wind, this book is for you. Raven Bloodstone. Forward. History is not written in ink, but in the memory of the land. The tale of Scotland is no ordinary history. It is not only a record of kings and battles, but the chronicle of a soul, a nation that has lived through ages of darkness and dawn, whose people have kept faith with their land even when the world forgot them. This work is not merely a study of events. It is an invocation. Each chapter is a step into the mist where myth and fact embrace, where the Picts carve their mysteries upon stone, where the Celts raise their songs to the sun, where the clans stand defiant beneath the banner of freedom, and where the eternal spirit of Alba still burns in every Highland heart. Through centuries of conquest and sorrow, the Scots have remained themselves, poets, warriors, dreamers, and survivors. To tell their story is to tell the story of endurance itself. In these pages you will find not just history, but the heartbeat of a people. May it stir your own, as it has mine. Raven Bloodstone. Author's note. I wrote this book as both historian and poet, for Scotland deserves to be remembered in both truth and song. The research behind these pages draws upon archaeology, chronicles, and oral tradition, but it also listens to the voices that speak through the stones, the rivers, and the wind. The Scots are a people who carry memory like flame, tenderly, fiercely, and with reverence. To write of them is to walk between worlds, between fact and legend, between faith and myth, between the living and the ancestral. I have sought to honor all of these, for history is not cold record. It is the living echo of the soul of humankind, and nowhere does that echo sing more beautifully than in Alba. Preface. To the History of Scotland and Her Clans by Raven Bloodstone. In the mist there are voices, echoes of war horns, of prayers whispered to stone and sky. The mountains remember, even when men forget. There are lands that seem eternal, where wind and time weave the same song through the centuries, where each loch and glen whispers of battles fought, of gods once worshipped, and of kin bound by the blood of the land itself. Scotland, ancient Alba, is such a realm. Here myth and history are not strangers. They are brothers, bound by heather and stone, by storm and song. Long before the castles crowned her hills or the clans took names that would echo through the ages, there were tribes who carved spirals into stone and raised monoliths to the turning of the heavens. They were the Picts, the painted ones, mysterious and fierce, whose art spoke the language of gods and animals, and whose memory survives in the earth they once ruled. From the west came the Gaels of Dalriada, sailors and poets, bringing with them a language of fire and faith. Their mingling with the Picts gave birth to a people, proud, defiant, and enduring, who would one day be called Scots. Through centuries of invasion, unification, and rebellion, Scotland's heart has never stilled. The Romans could not tame her mountains. The Norse could not break her spirit. The English could not silence her voice. Her story is one of survival, not merely of bloodlines, but of belief. Beneath the cloak of Christianity lingered the green flame of Druidic faith, the reverence for nature, the sanctity of the seasons, and the unseen presence of the divine feminine, the mother of the land. To understand Scotland and her clans is to walk through both shadow and sunlight, to hear the laments sung beside the fire and the cries of warriors on the moor. It is to trace the lineage of the people who lived in harmony with the earth, who honored their ancestors, and who stood unyielding before empire. This work seeks to uncover that lineage, to blend the echoes of archaeology with the whispers of legend, and to tell once more the living story of Alba, her tribes, her faith, and her indomitable soul. For Scotland is not just a land. She is a living myth, written in mist and stone. Chapter 1. Before the clans, the land of the Picts. They carved their secrets in stone, that the hills might remember when men no longer could. Before the names of Scotland's clans were spoken, before tartan or banner, before the war pipes off the highlands called to battle, there was a people who ruled the mists. They were the Picts, the first lords of Alba, whose memory lingers in the stones of the north, in the carvings of beasts and circles that mark the sacred places of an older world. To the Romans they were Picti, the painted ones, for they adorned their skin with woad and symbol, claiming kinship with the powers of the earth and sky. But to themselves, they were the children of the mother, guardians of a land where sea and mountain met in wild embrace. Their homeland stretched from the shadowed shores of Fife and Angus to the far reaches of Caithness and Orkney, a realm of forests and lochs, of standing stones and whispers. The land and its people. The Picts were not a single tribe but a constellation of kingdoms: Fortriu, Cate, Su, Fib, and Sursen, names half remembered from the mists, each ruled by its own king or queen, yet bound by kinship and ritual. Their hill forts crowned the ridges of Benahi and Scone, their homes whirring forts and crannogs, islands of wood and stone upon dark waters. They were farmers, hunters, and herders, yet also seafarers and traders who crossed to the Northern Isles and the Irish coast. Their craftsmanship in bronze, gold, and enamel was unmatched in early Britain, revealing a people who wove beauty into every tool and weapon. But above all, they were artists of the sacred. Their symbol stones, carved with crescent moons, serpents, double discs, mirrors, and beasts, were more than ornament. They were a language of spirit. To look upon a Pictish stone was to read a prayer. The mysteries of the Pictish faith. Their religion was the old faith of the earth. The goddess of the land was their first and last devotion, a being later remembered as the Cailleach, the ancient hag of winter who shaped the mountains from her apron of stones. The stag, the boar, and the salmon were her messengers, the sun and moon her eyes upon the world. The Picts knew the rivers as living powers: Deva, the goddess Di; Tava, the goddess Te; and Ness, the guardian of the deep waters. In every loch, they saw a doorway to the other world, a shimmering threshold where mortals might meet the Siddhi, the divine spirits of the hills and mounds. Their priests were the early druids of the north, keepers of the old calendar, of solstice fires and lunar rites. Around the stones of Callanish and Clava cairns, they marked the turning of the heavens, honoring the union of sky and soil, the eternal marriage that kept the world in balance. Even when Christianity came across the sea, the Picts did not easily abandon their gods. They cloaked them instead in new names and saints, weaving their pagan spirit into the fabric of the new faith, so that beneath every kirk and abbey still beat the heart of the old religion. The women of Alba. Unlike many of their later neighbors, Pictish society honored the lineage of women. Queens and noble daughters inherited rule, and sacred kingship was conferred through the maternal line. It was said that no man could claim the crown unless his mother was royal. Thus the spirit of the goddess, the sovereignty of the land itself, passed through the womb of woman. The throne of Alba was not merely political, it was spiritual, bound to the earth and her cycles. This matrilineal heritage gave rise to legends of warrior queens, such as the fierce bridey daughters of Fortriu, who led armies as much by spirit as by sword. In their image would later be born the great heroines of Celtic myth: Scathach, the shadow warrior of Skye, and the Morrigan, who rode upon the winds of battle. Symbols in stone. No chapter of Scottish history is more enigmatic than that written on the Pictish stones. Across Angus, Aberdeenshire, Moray, and Sutherland, hundreds of monuments stand, carved with eagles, serpents, double discs, crescents, mirrors, and beasts unknown to natural kind. Each symbol held meaning within the web of Pictish cosmology. The crescent and Virad Mahave symbolized the moon and the measure of time, the double disk and Zerod, the balance of life and death, or the joining of mortal and divine. The beast, sinuous and long-necked, was perhaps the guardian of the otherworld, ancestor of the legends of Loch Ness itself. These stones were not graves, but gateways, markers of sacred ground and ritual passage. When a clans arose centuries later, they would still build upon these same sites, erecting chapels and cairns upon the bones of Pictish sanctuaries, as if drawn unconsciously to the spirit that lingered there. The end and the transformation. By the 9th century, the Pictish kingdoms began to fade from record. The annals tell of war and plague, of Norse incursions, and the growing power of the Scots of Dalriada. Yet it is said that the Picts did not vanish. They became Scots. Through alliance, marriage, and the vision of Kenneth MacAlpin, the lineages of Pict and Gael intertwined, giving birth to the realm of Alba, the seed of modern Scotland. But beneath the Gaelic tongue and Christian cross, the ancient spirit of the Picts endured. Their sacred sites remained. Their symbols survived in folklore and design. Even the Highlanders of later centuries carried echoes of their forebears in their reverence for stone circles, wells, and spirits of the glen. Thus begins the story of a land where gods walked among mortals, and mortals carved their faith into stone. The Picts, the first Scots, were not lost, only transformed. Their voices still murmur through the mist, and their symbols still shine when the moon rises over the standing stones of Alba. Chapter 2. The coming of the Gaels, the fusion of Dalriada and Alba. Out of the western sea they came, with sails of woven light and songs of the sun. And upon the shores of Alba, they met their kindred of the mist. When the Picts ruled the misty glens of the north, another people stirred across the western sea, a people of poets and warriors, whose bards sang of Tara and Eriu, and whose kings claimed descent from the gods of the sun. They were the Gaels of Dalriada, and their coming would shape the destiny of Scotland forever. The voyage from Eriu. Across the narrow waters of the Sea of Moyle Liriu, the island now called Ireland, land of the Milesians, of bards, druids, and warrior kings. In its northern kingdom of Dalriada, men of the Clan Sinel and Gabron looked eastward to the shadowed mountains beyond the sea. They saw not a foreign shore, but the reflection of their own, a twin realm waiting to be claimed. Legend tells that around the 5th century, a prince named Fergus Mór Mac Airk sailed with his kin and retinue from Antrim to the coast of Argyll. There they built their first strongholds among Felix and Isles, Dunad, Denali, and Lorne, carving a new Dalriada of Albalpon Scottish soil. But theirs was no invasion in the crude sense. The Gaels came as settlers, traders, and kin to those already there. The Picts of the western coast shared bloodlines and beliefs with them. Their speech and symbols already echoed those of Erin. And so, through marriage and alliance, the sons of Galen the daughters of Pict mingled, and the ancient heart of Scotland began to beat as one. The realm of Dalriada. Dalriada's lands lay between mountain and sea, a realm of deep glens, fertile pastures, and island chains scattered like jewels upon the western ocean. The kings of Dalriada ruled both shores of the Moyle for a time, uniting the Irish and Scottish branches under one spirit. Their court at Dunad, now a moss-covered hill crowned with carved footprints and Ogham inscriptions, was the center of kingship and ritual. Upon that stone, it was said, each king placed his foot within the carved print of his ancestor and swore his oaths to the goddess of the land. In that act-off union, he became not merely ruler of men, but husband of Alba herself. The bards sang of his coronation in the old tongue, a sacred marriage between man and soil, between the mortal and divine. This was the same right once held among the Picts, proving that beneath their differing tongues lay a shared soul. The Gaels and the Picts. For centuries, The Picts of the East and the Gaels of the West lived as neighbors, at times allies, at times rivals. Yet their destinies were bound. The Picts held the mountain heartland and the northern plains, the Gaels, the islands, and the coast. Between them rose the highland spine of mountains, a barrier and a bridge. Their interactions were not only of war, but of culture and faith. The Druids of Dalriada shared their lore with the wise men of Pictland. The sacred fires of Beltane and Samhain burned on both sides of the land. Even their gods began to merge. Lughoff the Gaels with Lugasoff the Picts, Brigid with the ancient Brydoff the northern Wells, Cernunnos, the horned one, with the Highland Cusith, guardian of the forest spirits. Over time, the boundaries blurred. The Picts, though proud and ancient, found in the Gaels a kindred flame, a people whose reverence for poetry, lineage, and land mirrored their own. And when the storms of the north darkened, when Norsemen began to raid the coasts, the two peoples would find unity in necessity, forging the first bonds of a greater nation. The Christian Mission and St. Columba. Amid this merging of tribes came the dawn of a new faith. In the year 563, St. Columba, Columcille, a noble of Irish blood and monk of Iona, sailed across the sea with 12 companions. His mission was to bring the word of Christ to the people of Dalriada, and through them, to all of Alba. But Columba was no mere preacher of Rome. He was a mystic of the Celtic Church, whose Christianity was born of both cross and cauldron, a faith that revered the natural world as God's first scripture. On the Isle of Iona, he founded a monastery that became the spiritual heart of the Gaelic world, a beacon of light amid the mists. Columba's miracles and visions were many. He banished monsters from the river Ness, blessed kings, and saw angels upon the winds. But more than this, he united the Gaels under the sign of peace, and through his influence, bridged the worlds of druid and monk. Many of the old rituals were simply given new form. The wells of Brigid became wells of Mary, and the sun cross of the pagans became the Celtic cross of the saints. In this way, the soul of the old faith endured, clothed now in Christian guise. Toward the unification of Alba. By the 9th century, Norse longships haunted the western seas, and kingdoms rose and fell like waves. Yet from the turmoil emerged a figure destined to bind the divided land. Kenneth mac Alpin, Cyned mac Alpin, that a son of both Pictish and Gaelic descent, Kenneth united the thrones of Dalriada and Pictland around 843 AD, founding the Kingdom of Alba, the first true Scotland. Through him, the blood of the Painted Ones and the seafarers became one river. The Pictish kingship faded into legend, but its spirit lived on in the clans, in the symbols, in the reverence for the land and the gods of old. The Gaels, with their songs and sagas, carried that legacy forward, giving it voice in their language, Gaelic, the tongue of the Highlands. Thus, from the union of mist and sea was born the soul of Scotland, a fusion of the seen and unseen, of the warrior and the poet, of the ancient and the eternal. Legacy of Dalriada. Even now, the stones of Dunad bear the footprint of the kings, the agam of the old tongue, and the glimmer of that sacred beginning. From this marriage of Pict and Gael would rise the clans, families bound by land and honor, guardians of an ancient promise between people and earth. For though kingdoms may fall and languages fade, the spirit of Dalriada and Alba endures in every mountain, every loch, and every heart that beats for Scotland. Chapter 3. The Druids of Caledonia, keepers of the northern mysteries. When the oak was the temple and the stars the roof, the Druids spoke to gods unseen, and the land itself was their altar. Long before cathedrals rose upon Scottish soil, long before the psalms of monks echoed through Theglands, there stood other sanctuaries, silent, vast, and older than memory. These were the temples of the Druids of Caledonia, whose faith was not carved in stone but rooted in the living earth. Their wisdom flowed through the oak groves and across the moors, their voices echoing through the valleys of mist and rain. The Druids were the priests, philosophers, judges, and healers of the Celtic world, guardians of knowledge and interpreters of the divine will. In Caledonia, they were more than religious leaders. They were keepers of the balance between man and nature, between tribe and spirit, between this world and the next. To understand the Scotland of the clans, one must first understand the Druids who shaped its soul. Temples of the earth and sky. Unlike the Romans who raised marble temples, the Druids built with nature itself. Their sanctuaries were circles of stone and oak, often set upon hills aligned to the stars. The Callanish Stonesoft Lewis, Thering of Brodger and Orkney, and the Clava cairns near Inverness are all remnants of this ancient faith, each placed with precision to mark the solstices, equinoxes, and lunar cycles. To the Druid, these were not mere monuments, but living instruments, a means to commune with the cosmos. The rising sun of midwinter that struck the stones was not light alone, but a divine visitation, the renewal of the sun's spirit, the rekindling of life after the long dark. The oak was their sacred tree, the dura from which the word druid itself is thought to come, meaning wisdom of the oak. Within its shade, they gathered to teach and to judge, their white robes gleaming amid the green shadows of the forest. The oak's strength, endurance, and connection between heaven and earth symbolized the Druidic creed that all worlds, physical, spiritual, and divine, were branches of one living tree. The teachings and philosophy. The Druids held that the universe was a vast cycle of birth, death, and renewal. Nothing was ever lost, only transformed. Souls passed from form to form, learning through each incarnation until they reached the realm of the gods. To them, death was not an end but a doorway. This belief made their warriors fearless and their poets serene. The Druid taught that every creature possessed a spirit, that rivers and stones were alive, and that to harm nature was to wound the divine. Their lore was preserved not in books, but in memory. Knowledge was sacred, passed through generations by oral tradition. The Druid schools of Caledonia were said to train initiates for 20 years before they were permitted to speak as teachers. They learned the movements of the stars, the healing of herbs, the history of tribes, the laws of honor, and the secret correspondences between heaven and earth. It was a science of the soul, a synthesis of observation and reverence, where astronomy, medicine, music, and magic were threads of one web. The rites of Caledonia. Each season of the year was marked by sacred ceremony, honoring the eternal dance of sun and moon, life and death. Samhain, the Feast of Shadows, marked the year's end and the thinning of the veil between worlds. Fires were lit upon the hills to guide the spirits home. Imbolc, the Feast of Brigid, honored the first stirrings of spring and the rebirth of the goddess as maiden. Beltane, the Festival of Fire, celebrated fertility and the sacred union of male and female, Opharth and Sky. Lugnasad, the Festival of the sun god Lugh, gave thanks for the harvest and the strength of the tribe. These rites were more than superstition. They were the rhythm of the land itself. Each fire lit upon the hilltops was a heartbeat of the nation, keeping alive the link between the human and the divine. At the center of every ceremony stood the Druid, staff in hand, invoking the four elements and unseen powers. To him, the wind was thought, the flame was will, the water was emotion, and the earth was form, and from these all life was born. The Druidic priesthood and women of power. Unlike later religious orders, the Druids did not confine their mysteries to men. Women were priestesses, seers, and healers. Many tribes revered them as oracles and midwives of both life and destiny. Among the northern isles and the glens of Skye, tales speak of the Band Druid, women who could call the wind, heal the sick, and foresee battle. They were honored as the living vessels of the goddess, the earthly manifestation of sovereignty. In them the divine feminine found her voice, continuing the matrilineal heritage of the Picts. Conflict with Rome. When the Roman legions came north under Agricola, they encountered not mere warriors but as spiritual resistance. Tacitus wrote that upon the island of Mona, Anglesey, the Druids stood before the invading army, torches in hand, chanting curses, their women wailing like furies that in Caledonia, the same fierce devotion burned. The Romans called the northern tribes barbarity, but they feared the Druids' power more than their swords. Though the empire pressed deep into Scotland, they could never tame its heart. For the Druids fought not from ambition but from duty. They defended the soul of the land itself. When the Roman eagle retreated south of the Antonine Wall, the Druids of Alba remained, their fires burning anew in the shadowed glens. The decline and transformation. With the rise of Christianity came a slow eclipse of the Druidic order. Yet in Scotland, conversion did not mean destruction. The new faith absorbed the old, transforming gods into saints and rituals into sacraments. The wells of Brigid became holy wells of Saint Bride. The oak groves became churchyards. The Druids' reverence for the triad, land, sea, and sky, became the Christian Trinity. The monks of Iona and the Celtic Church carried forward the Druidic spirit in gentler form, still entering nature, still counting the days by sun and moon, still seeing God in every living thing. Thus the Druids of Caledonia never truly vanished. They simply changed their robes. Legacy in the clans. In later centuries, when the clans rose as the children of the land, their customs bore the mark of Druidic teaching. The chieftain, sworn to defend his people and honor the goddess of his territory, was a descendant in spirit of the sacred kings of old. Thebards, keepers of genealogy and history, were heirs of the Druidic schools. Their songs preserved not only memory but magic. The Seers off the Highlands, with their second sight and prophetic dreams, carried forward the ancient art of vision. Even the very sense of kinship, the bond between land and clan, was Druidic at its root. For the Druids taught that the land and the people are one. If the land prospers, so shall its children, and if it is defiled, they too shall wither. The enduring flame. In the midst of the highlands, the old flame still burns. It flickers in the customs of Beltane fires upon the hilltops, in the blessing of the wells, in the reverence for sacred groves and holy islands. It survives in the Gaelic prayers that weave Christian names with pagan cadences, invoking saints and spirits alike. For the Druids of Caledonia were not merely priests of a forgotten faith, they were the architects of a way of seeing. Their vision endures wherever one looks upon the mountains of Scotland and feels the presence of something greater than oneself. Their temples may have fallen to ruin, but their spirit moves with the wind across the heather. The wisdom of the oak remains rooted in the soul of Alba. End of preview of Volume 3. End of preview of the Great Celtic Saga by Bloodstone. Book to be published soon.